Hi, everybody, and welcome to recorded class over APUSH. Today we are in the American century. We are in the section of the Second New Deal. We have four objectives today. By the end of class today, you should be able to identify the main proponents of economic justice in the 1930s and explain how they were advocated. You should be able to examine the major initiatives of the Second New Deal and analyze the way they differed from the First New Deal. You should be able to assess the way in which the New Deal recast the meaning of American freedom. You should be able to identify significant entertainers and entertainment of the 1930s. Let's begin in Roman numeral 24. So when Roosevelt was elected, his election as president did a lot to rekindle hope among labor, who was having a hard time in the economic changes, but also just the overall downtrend in organized like unions and union labor. Workers were given legal protections that allowed them to organize unions. The result was there was, for the first time in a long time, a turnaround in union membership. That unions were increasing with huge protests that came as a result. In 1934, there were over 2,000 strikes nationwide, and that is a crazy high number. Labor union upheaval in the 1930s posed a challenge to the American Federation of Labor. The AFL had organized workers by trade, whether welders or machine mechanics, but the AFL, in their putting them into individual trades, didn't unite the workers in an entire industry, such as something like steel manufacturing. Some union leaders wanted to unite the various industries, various unions within an industry. So rather than focusing on like welders or machine mechanics, you could focus on auto workers, something like that. So when the AFL refused to organize all of their unions together into an industry rather than to a trade, the head of the mine workers union, which was John Lewis, led a walkout of the AFL and produced a new labor organization, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO. In the CIO, there was one particular group called the United Auto Workers. They led a sit-down strike in 1936 that was surprisingly effective. It's a great picture of them just like sitting on the upholstered seats of cars and stuff in a sit-down work. So rather than walking out and letting scabs or like workers that weren't union members go take their jobs, rather than let scabs take the jobs, the sit-down strike held the factory. They halted work to force a confrontation. The UAW, the United Auto Workers, their strike spread to factories across the state of Michigan, and they even broke the will of Henry Ford. Who would finally allow unions to negotiate with unions in Ford factories. Union membership by 1940 had jumped to 9 million members, and the later upsurge altered the balance of economic power and propelled to the forefront of politics America's goal of a fairer, freer, more equal America. The CIO, that Congress of Industrial Workers, explained the Depression as a result of an imbalance of wealth and income. So basically, you've got now a competing view of what caused the Great Depression, which was an imbalance of wealth, and it was organized, or a way to try to address that was through greater organized labor unions. I'd like to introduce here a guy named Huey Long. Huey Long was at one time governor of Louisiana, turned United States Senator from Louisiana. And Huey Long, he proposed a number of drastic measures to try to organize the inequality of wealth. Not organize is a bad word. To rectify the inequality of wealth. He proposed capping personal fortunes at $50 million each, and basically said if anybody had any more than that, then it would be the restructured progressive federal tax code would basically seize that wealth to use for government coffers. And then they would share the resulting revenue to the public through government benefits and public work. So if any one person was too rich, the government would take the money and go redistribute it out from there. At first, he was an ally of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Was very hopeful that FDR would follow him into this idea. But he eventually turned on the president because he didn't think that Roosevelt was going far enough. Huey Long disliked the rich people, and he disliked banks, and his motto was every man a king. And he expanded hospitals and schools in his times of Louisiana. With massive highways and bridge construction, he set up a charity hospitals for the poor and the free textbooks for children. And he basically was originally an advocate of FDR, but later became a critic of him for not going far enough, which also tells us a little bit about FDR, that he was always pursuing like the middle path between fascism and socialism. Huey Long was eventually shot and killed in 1935 by the guy in the bottom right corner, Dr. Carl Weiss. There's kind of a conspiracy theory surrounding it, because then Huey Long's bodyguards shot Dr. Weiss also, so we never got a chance to learn about the motives or the explanations behind it, leaving conspiracy theorists with enough room to come up with some pretty crazy ideas. The next person I'd like you to meet is Charles Coughlin. Father Charles Coughlin was a Roman Catholic priest and pretty controversial. He was also a radio broadcaster. and had 30 million listeners at his peak. That would still be one of the most amazingly listened to radio shows ever. He was he was an ally of Huey Long and basically took like a moral side to the economic arguments of Huey Long. And like Huey Long, he started out as a fan of FDR, but eventually turned against him in 1934 and formed a group known as the National Union for Social Justice. It was the National Union for Social Justice that called for nationalization of major industries and railroads and protections of the rights of labor. Basically, it was more or less trying to socialize the industries. He was also anti-banker. He had suggestions of anti-Semitism. Then he began to support some of Hitler and Mussolini's ideas under the slogan of social justice. The Vatican really tried to figure out how to silence this guy, but didn't really understand how the American system worked. And it was the FDR government. It was actually the Roosevelt administration that was able to cancel his show when war broke out in 1939 under some war powers moves, and was able to silence him. But was a very influential person in bringing a moral and theological side to economic changes as well. The next person to meet is Francis Townsend. He was a doctor, and he basically thought that FDR programs were okay, but didn't go far enough. Kind of a classic position here. Townsend was originally an enthusiastic promoter of FDR. In particular, he admired things like Social Security, but he felt that the elderly deserved basically twice as much as FDR was allocating for them. So he, like others, broke away from FDR and accused him of abandoning the movement and not going far enough to basically socialize the country. Our next person to meet is Eleanor Roosevelt, whom we have met before. Eleanor Roosevelt was FDR's wife, and she transformed the role of the First Lady. She's really a transformative figure and quite an interesting study in American history. She turned the job of the First Lady from presidential hostess into a policy basically of political action. She was not super interested in just hosting tea parties. She traveled widely. She spoke to a lot of groups. She voiced opinions, which were oftentimes even more, I don't want to say extreme, but to the political left of her husband. She authored a weekly newspaper column. She had her own radio show and was very influential. She traveled the country and talked with basically every kind of person. It was her goal to go meet every person or every type of person that she could in the country. And she was FDR's eyes and ears for a man who wasn't very mobile, who, ravaged by polio and wasn't able to get out and get around. Eleanor Roosevelt became his eyes and ears to do so. She wrote little notes. She slipped him under his bedroom door. They slept separately. Remember, it wasn't a super happy marriage. And told him what she thought needed to be done. She was a close policy advisor to the president. She basically shared all of the same goals as the president, but different methods to reach them. She also was trying to push FDR further and further down the path. She was deeply concerned with helping every person, no matter how neglected they might seem. While Eleanor Roosevelt was a pillar of feminist success, organized feminism overall was kind of in a mess by the 1920s, and overall, by the time you reached the Great Depression, was no longer a significant political force, Eleanor Roosevelt notwithstanding. Most New Deal programs didn't outright exclude women from benefits, but the idea of a male-headed household powerfully shaped social policy of the day. And this brings us to Roman numeral number 25, the Second New Deal. Largely, the New Deal failed. It struck down by a lot of the courts, and it didn't ultimately pull the country out of the Depression. In the growing popular clamor for greater economic equality, he launched in 1935 what became known as the Second New Deal. The emphasis of the Second New Deal was economic security. It no longer became about trying to pull the country out of the Depression as much as just stabilize the economy overall. It focused on new target audiences, and here's really the characteristic of the New Deal, that it doesn't look overall, how do you improve the American economy? It tries to focus on groups and segments of people, things like farmers or labor unions or Democratic State Party organizations or city machines or blue collar workers or minorities or farmers or white Southerners or people in relief and intellectuals. And they basically try to like organize people into groups and improve the condition of a certain group of people. And broadly speaking, those groups could be lumped into what became known as the New Deal Coalition. It became a bloc of loyal Democratic voters clear up to the late 1960s when there was a political realignment. We'll get to that, but not for several weeks. Besides defining his supporters, FDR portrayed the rich as his political opponents and also his economic opponents. He called rich people economic royalists and the enemy within our gates. In his famous line, his famous speech, "The Rendezvous with Destiny," it was a presidential nomination acceptance speech in 1936, the Democratic National Convention. So, pieces of the Second New Deal. We'll start with the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. The WPA was like a very large workfare employment program. It wasn't a welfare program. He basically said that if a person was going to receive any kind of a government assistance, they needed to go work for it. And they worked, around 3 million men from every walk of life in the country worked for a decade on building projects across the country. It was under the direction of Harry Hopkins. The WPA changed the physical face of the United States. Public buildings, bridges, 500,000 miles of roads, 600 airports, stadiums, swimming pools, sewage treatment plants. It was white-collar workers, lawyers, doctors, dentists, etc. Basically, the WPA would hire just about anybody, but its most enduring piece that I think we look at today was largely in the arts: murals, theater performances, academic works of history and anthropology, dance programs, orchestras, choral groups. The WPA wasn't just about building roads, it was also about finding meaningful work for a lot of people in a lot of places. We also see the development of what political scientists refer to as the American welfare state, and we'll begin this discussion with Social Security. The centerpiece of the Second New Deal was the Social Security Act of 1935. In general, Roosevelt wanted to support workfare, not welfare. He wanted to try to get people into jobs and earning income, but Roosevelt was also very sensitive to people who weren't able to. I mean, remember, this is a guy who's partially paralyzed with polio and understands that not everybody's in the position to work. And so let's turn to Social Security. It's a retirement insurance program to provide money to people over the age of 65. The way it works is that people pay into the system. This still exists today, and if you have a job that earns a paycheck, then you're still part of it today. They pay into the system while they're young and working, and they collect benefits when they retire. At the time, there was about 16 workers paying in for every single person collecting. That has dramatically changed today. There's about 2 people working for every person collecting, more or less. But the first people to collect never paid anything in. Social Security was always intended to be a supplement, not something to live on. But again, that has also kind of developed over time. The first person to run this was Frances Perkins. She wanted the states to run Social Security and have the workers pay for it themselves. Roosevelt preferred to fund Social Security by taxes and employers on workers. He believed in the program, if it was funded by taxes, it would make the program secure and irrevocable, and that's pretty true. You pay into Social Security and you can expect to receive it, just like the first welfare recipient, Ida Mae Fuller, who didn't pay in at all but was able to receive. Today, it's pretty much guaranteed you're contributing to Social Security, you're going to get it. It may change by the time you're ready to receive it, but you can receive it. There's other people that receive Social Security as well. People who are disabled, orphans for a period of time also receive Social Security. And this is, again, I think, keeping in the spirit of what FDR said, that if people can work, they should work, and if they can't, we should care for them. Social Security emerged as a hybrid of national and local funding, national and local control, national and local eligibility standards. It represented a dramatic departure from the traditional functions of government. Roman numeral 26. FDR was the master of modern media, perhaps maybe the greatest of his day, and was a real game changer in the way that presidents communicated with the rest of the world. He was the master of modern media, which was the radio and the movie house newsreel. He spoke in a way that the average person felt a powerful connection to him. Even though FDR himself was kind of an elitist person from a rich old family, he didn't talk that way, and he didn't seem that way when people spoke to him. His language was simple and direct and intimate. It was often compared to people like Lincoln or McKinley or Teddy Roosevelt, who were masters of their era's media, just like later we would look at JFK and Reagan and Clinton, and I would argue Obama, and perhaps Trump was really a master of their era's media as also. You compare him to somebody like Herbert Hoover, who struck people as stiff and unrelatable relatable in a time that people really, really wanted to relate to their leaders. In 1936, Roosevelt ran for re-election, and he fought for the what he called the ideal of freedom, and emerged as the central issue of the political campaign in 1936. American Republicans chose the governor of Kansas, a guy named Alf Landon, who was a former Theodore Roosevelt-style progressive. Alf Landon opposed Social Security, he called it, and other New Deal programs threats to individual freedom. Basically, Landon got stomped. It was a lopsided, crushing. It's just ugly, I guess. With popular vote of 27.7 million to 16.6 million. For years and years, Alf Landon was on the state assessment for Kansas as somebody worth knowing about. I always felt that was kind of like rubbing it in on us. Subpoint C. Frustrated by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had declared a lot of the New Deal programs and the second New Deal programs to be unconstitutional. And in response, FDR had a pretty clever solution in 1937. He said, the Constitution doesn't say how many people should be on the Supreme Court. It's 9, but it's 9 by tradition. What if it was more than that? And so he responded with what he called, and what other people called, the court packing plan, where Roosevelt wanted to add 7 more justices to the Supreme Court. If he nominated the justices, then he could pick who they were, and they could vote in all of his policies, which they would presumably favor. This was alarming to Americans. It seems like cheating as a way of trying to subvert or destroy the Constitution. It would have given Roosevelt 2 out of the 3 branches of government. The plan raised cries the president was an aspiring dictator, and it was rejected. But the court packing plan, it's not a good idea, but it is kind of clever. In 1937, the Supreme Court, though, seemed to be more willing to accept the New Deal programs that turned aside challenges to Social Security and the Wagner Act to protect unions. The court's new willingness to accept the New Deal marked a permanent change in judicial policy. Subpoint D. The Fair Labor Standards Bill banned goods produced by child labor, basically saying that child labor was, there's a couple of reasons why it's not good. One, because kids don't need to be working in factories, but 2, they were probably taking jobs that adults could earn for more income, and it set like a new minimum wage, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and required overtime pay for hours of work exceeding 40 hours a week, and kind of just sort of modernized what people would expect out of labor and paychecks. The economist John Maynard Keynes, who we met in our last class, in his now famous work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, which is only marginally more interesting than its title suggests, called for deep deficit spending to spur growth. The Keynesian plan became the model of FDR's economic plan, and shifting from relief to the needy to overall economic growth. Then in 1937, everything seemed to get worse. The economy took a sharp downturn. The depression within the depression in 1937, where 2 million people lost their jobs, and unemployment jumped from 14% to, or a little over 14% to almost 19% in 1938. And for a certain segment of people, they were back into living in those shanty towns, those Hoovervilles, those Rooseveltvilles. FDR was losing support from Southern Democrats. New Deal policies had upset Southern race relations, and they were no longer willing to cooperate with Roosevelt's heavy-handed leadership. There was a period of political stalemate, which followed the congressional election of 1938, where Republicans picked up seats in the House, and they often teamed up with Southern Democrats to throw legislation which would be rejected by FDR. He concluded that the enactment of the New Deal measures required a liberalization of the Southern Democratic Party and set out for political realignment in the South. And a slight change, we're going to go to Roman numeral 27 and talk about sort of the broader culture of the 1930s, because not everything can be boiled down to economic or political moves. There's also people living everyday life. The first thing we'll talk about are the movies, and there's a lot of really inventive and fun movies of the era. The first one I want to talk about were the Marx Brothers. It was a group of actual brothers who started out as vaudeville actors, so like on stage, on Broadway, then made the jump to motion pictures, became a national sensation. During the Depression, they were really the biggest stars, this group of brothers who were a comedy duo, fast talking and zany antics. They're pretty funny. The next group we'll talk about is Disney, which its first feature-length animated production was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Walt Disney, he's really underrated today, and I think, which is hard to say because he's pretty highly rated, but he's so transformative in the way that movies are told and storytelling happens. And you take, for instance, something like Snow White, which is an artificial medium. He's drawing it. This is all hand illustrated. But he has new cameras which will allow animation to pan and zoom and have multi-planes where, anyway, it's brilliant, and he's so transformative to the industry. Snow White, if it seems tame today, it's only because everything today lives in the shadow of Snow White. What is argued the adjusted for inflation, the still most popular movie of all time, Gone with the Wind, is a movie adaptation of a Margaret Mitchell novel. And the movie is brilliant. It's also long. It's so long there's an intermission in the middle of it, with some of the greatest zingers in film from Gone with the Wind. And the last thing we'll talk about is The Wizard of Oz. Wizard of Oz was actually a remake of a 1925 silent film. It was the most impressive. It was the most successful use of a new medium known as Technicolor. Technicolor film process is like you see the transition from Kansas, which is black and white, and then boom, you hit Oz and everything becomes full color and brilliant. And the movie makers changed the process and ultimately changed storytelling. We'll do as much music as we can without actually listening to the music in this recorded piece, but there were pop stars like Fred Astaire and Gene Autry and Bing Crosby and Billie Holiday and Roy Rogers and Ginger Rogers and Shirley Temple and Ethel Waters, and a lot of them were crossover hits in film as much as music. We also see a development of, jazz music is changing, where what was originally a small group or 5 or 6 musicians playing together by the 1930s, by the late 1930s, there it's the big band style with pretty significantly sized orchestras. Count Basie, Tommy Dorsey, Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, Woody Herman, Henry James, Glenn Miller, Artie Shaw. Jazz music in this day was largely segregated, as there was music that black people listened to and music that white people listened to, and there wasn't a ton of crossover in the 1930s that pretty much people fell into their groups. Other cultural pieces of the 1930s. In 1935, 2 years after Prohibition was instituted, we see 2 years after Prohibition, 1930, was founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. It was founded by a stockbroker and a physician who just became known as Bill and Dr. Bob, and they tried to address the alcoholism at the time. AA is a very local American-style organization. It's locally organized. There's no dues. It's optional. A person can come and go. It's community-based. It's really about individual responsibility, the ability of people to chart their own destinies. For new attendees, it's often recommended that people go to 90 meetings in 90 days as really kind of a realignment of individual practices. The model became the model for many other programs like Narcotics Anonymous or Gamblers Anonymous. AA is a brilliant program, and I can say from experience of people in my family that have been there, it truly is a life-changing organization. Subpoint D. In terms of writing, we have maybe one of the greatest decades in American literature. And just to a start, you might look at like William Faulkner and the Southern Gothic stream of consciousness style of writing, Sound of the Fury, Absalom. So much of this stuff is like a Scholar's Bowl day today. John Steinbeck, who is, if not my favorite American author, the other of my favorite American authors. John Steinbeck was really, really great at connecting with the working class. Some of the most famous pieces are The Grapes of Wrath, which is about the Joad family trying to get established during the Great Depression and going looking for work, and Of Mice and Men, which is a brilliant piece, and some of you went to the KC Rep earlier this year and watched that. Eugene O'Neill was a playwright. He was a realist playwright and transformative of the American stage. That sometimes theater on stage is very big and sort of just kind of believable, but Eugene O'Neill made it an emphasis on realistic theater. And then writers like Agatha Christie, With her mystery novels, most notable of them is The Murder on the Orient Express. She is perhaps the best-selling novelist of all time in any genre, with somewhere around 2 billion books in print. It might be more than that. Publishers don't keep very good records. In terms of sports, there's a couple of people we will note here of the 1930s. Jesse Owens. Jesse Owens, a track athlete. He humiliated Hitler and the Nazis by winning the 1936 Olympics in Berlin while having the audacity of doing it as a black man. And then in sport, you have Lou Gehrig. Lou Gehrig played first base for the New York Yankees from 1923 through 1931. He was a lifetime 340 hitter, known for his durability. He was called the Iron Horse because he played 2,130 consecutive games, a record that held for 60 years and doesn't look like it's probably going to get broken anymore. Gehrig played, his play dropped off suddenly in 1939, and he lost control of his muscles in what became known as Lou Gehrig's disease, or more properly known as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. It's kind of a bummer way to end your notes, but you can save and close your notes. Jesus saves, and so should you.